Welcome to today's deep dive. I'm your host, ready to unpack some pretty wild history today.
And I'm your resident expert. Really looking forward to getting into this one. It's a fascinating topic.
It really is. So, to start us off, I want you to picture the most extravagant, out-of-control party you can possibly imagine.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
I'm talking champagne, just flowing like water, kings and emperors dancing until dawn, secret affairs happening in literally every corner of the room. Oh, and Beethoven, actually Ludwig van Beethoven is there conducting the orchestra for the guests.
It sounds like a Vanity Fair spread, right?
It does. I mean, it sounds like the social event of the century.
But here's the kicker. While all this partying is happening in the grand ballrooms of Vienna, the men in the back rooms are performing major surgery on a patient that is, well, practically dead on the operating table.
Right.
The patient is Europe. The year is 1814. And the surgeons are this group of, I think it's fair to say, terrified aristocrats who are trying to figure out how to put an entire continent back together after 25 years of total chaos. That is honestly the perfect way to frame the Congress of Vienna. You know, it is so often remembered for the pageantry. They called it the Dancing Congress. But the reality was much grimmer. Europe had been completely shattered by the French Revolution and the Napoleonic War.
Yeah, shattered is a good word for it.
The old order wasn't just damaged, it had been incinerated.
And that is exactly what we are unpacking today. We've got a great stack of sources here analyzing the age of Metternich. We've got maps of 1815 Europe, an analysis of the Quadruple Alliance, and a breakdown of the conservative versus liberal ideologies of the time.
All really crucial documents for understanding this era.
Yeah. We are going to look at how a handful of men, conservative, old school, arguably quite paranoid men, managed to secure nearly a century of relative peace. But, and this is the big mission for this deep dive, we have to ask at what price?
Because peace isn't free.
No.
And in 1815, the currency they used to pay for that peace was liberty.
So let's get into the heads of these guys. Set the scene for us. Who are the heavy hitters actually walking into the room in Vienna?
Well, it's the victors, naturally. You have the Quadruple Alliance. That's Great Britain, Russia, Prussia, and Austria. They're the ones who finally managed to crush Napoleon.
Right.
But the man running the show, the host of this massive party, is the Austrian foreign minister, Clemens von Metternich.
Metternich is so fascinating in the source material. He comes across less like a standard politician and more like a doctor trying to cure a deadly disease.
That is exactly how he saw himself. You really have to understand, for men like Metternich, the French Revolution wasn't just some political disagreement or a change in government. It was a social apocalypse.
Right, they watched their entire world catch fire.
Exactly. They had watched the French execute their king and queen, completely dismantle the church, and then spiral into the reign of terror. And then, out of that absolute chaos comes Napoleon, who just marches across Europe, toppling thrones that had stood for centuries.
So when they sit down in Vienna, they aren't thinking about, tax codes or trade tariffs. They're literally thinking, how do we stop the world from ending again?
Precisely. Their ideology, conservatism, wasn't just a political preference back then. It was a survival strategy.
Survival.
Yes. In their minds, liberalism, the idea that people should vote or have individual rights or write their own constitutions, that was the virus. It was the infection that led directly to the guillotine.
It's a pretty harsh diagnosis.
It is. But their goal was to inoculate Europe. They wanted to roll back the clock and restore the three pillars of the old world, which were tradition, the monarchy, and the church. They genuinely believed these were the only things keeping humanity from tearing itself apart.
Which brings us to this major buzzword in the text, which is legitimacy. It sounds very official, but in practice, looking at the sources, it feels like they were just hitting a giant undo button on history.
In many ways, they were. The principle of legitimacy essentially meant that the only valid rulers were the ones who were there by traditional, usually hereditary.
So merit didn't matter.
Not at all. It didn't matter if Napoleon was a genius administrator or if the people actually liked the reforms he brought. He wasn't legitimate.
So they literally drag the old furniture back into the house. They put the Bourbon family back on the French throne with Louis XVIII. They restore the Bourbons in Spain. But I have to ask, isn't that incredibly risky?
Oh, massively.
I mean, the French people had just spent 2 decades fighting and dying against that exact family. Putting them back seems like lighting a match in a gas station.
It was incredibly risky, and Metternich knew it. That is why the Congress wasn't just about restoration, it was about containment. But, this is where the story gets a lot more complex than just four guys sitting in a room agreeing on everything. The sources highlight a massive rift right in the middle of the alliance.
Yes, this is the Polish-Saxon crisis, right?
Hmm.
This part of the research actually really surprised me. I sort of thought they were all best friends because they beat Napoleon together.
Far from it. As soon as the common enemy was gone, they turned on each other immediately. Yeah. You had Tsar Alexander I of Russia, who, by the way, had become deeply mystical and religious at this point, demanding that he be made king of a reconstituted Poland. He wanted the whole thing.
And Prussia just says, fine, you take Poland, but we want all of Saxony.
Exactly. Saxony was a very wealthy German kingdom.
Yeah.
So you have Russia and Prussia making the secret pact to swap these territories. Austria and Great Britain looked at this and completely panicked.
Because of the balance of power.
Right. They realized that if Russia gobbled up Poland and Prussia took Saxony, the balance of power would shift drastically to the east.
So much for the peaceful Congress. They were on the brink of another war, right there in the middle of Vienna.
They were actively mobilizing armies. It got that tense. And this is where the story takes a turn that's honestly fit for a political thriller. Enter Charles Maurice de Talleyrand,
The French representative.
the representative of the defeated nation. Normally, the loser waits out in the hallway while the winners decide their fate. But Talleyrand was a diplomat of a totally different breed.
He saw an opening.
He did. He saw this split between the Allies, Russia and Prussia on one side, Austria and Britain on the other, and he just wedged himself right into the crack.
So he manipulated the winners.
He went to Metternich and Castlereagh, the British minister, and essentially said, you guys are worried about Russia and Prussia? Well, France still has an army. If you let us into the inner circle, we will back you up.
That is just audacious. Like, I know we just lost the war, but how would you like to hire us for the next one?
And it worked. A secret treaty was actually signed between Austria, Britain, and France to go to war against Russia and Prussia if it came to it.
That's wild.
When the Tsar found out he was suddenly facing a united front, he backed down. Russia got part of Poland, Prussia got part of Saxony, but not everything they wanted.
And France gets a seat at the big table.
France gets a seat at the table. It was an absolute masterclass in diplomacy. But it also served Metternich's bigger purpose, which was the balance of power.
Let's dig into that concept for a second. Because usually when you win a major war, you punish the loser. You take their land, you burn their capital, you make them pay. But the Congress was surprisingly lenient with France, according to the sources.
At first, yes. They restored France to its 1792 borders.
Mm-hmm.
The logic there was that if you destroy France, if you break it up into tiny pieces, you create a vacuum.
Right.
And in geopolitics, vacuums are always filled by the nearest aggressive power. If France is gone, maybe Russia just keeps marching west.
So they needed France to be sort of a zombie state.
Yeah.
Alive enough to occupy space on the map, but dead enough not to bite anyone.
That's a very colorful way to put it, but yes. They wanted a strong-ish France to balance the rest of the continent.
Wow.
But then we have the plot twist of the century, the 100 Days.
Napoleon breaks out of exile.
He escapes Elba, lands in France, and thousands of his old soldiers just flock to him. He marches on Paris, kicks out the newly restored King Louis, and rules for 100 days before finally being crushed at Waterloo.
That must have been an absolute nightmare for the delegates in Vienna. I mean, they're sitting there arguing about borders, and suddenly the boogeyman is literally back.
It terrified them, and it really hardened their resolve. After Waterloo, the peace terms got much harsher. France lost a bit more land, had to pay a massive indemnity, and had to accept an army of occupation for a few years.
But they still didn't destroy it.
Exactly. Even then, they didn't dismantle the country. They still needed that counterweight in the West.
Okay, so they keep France alive, but they obviously don't trust France at all. So they decide to engage in some very creative map making. The sources talk a lot about buffer states.
This is where we see the cold geometric logic of the Congress. They looked at the map and basically said, France is the aggressor. We need to surround it with states that are tough enough to take a punch.
Like putting bumpers on a bowling lane.
Exactly like that. Look at the north. You had the Austrian Netherlands, what we now call Belgium and the Dutch Republic. The Congress just mashed them together into one kingdom of the Netherlands.
Which sounds incredibly logical if you're just looking at a piece of paper. Terrible in reality.
Yeah.
You're mixing Catholics and Protestants, French speakers and Dutch speakers, completely different economies.
It was a recipe for disaster, and we'll see that explode a bit later. But to the map makers in Vienna, it made perfect sense. Big state equals strong barrier.
Right.
Then look at the east. They gave Prussia a huge chunk of land in the Rhineland, right on France's border.
So they physically moved Prussia.
They expanded Prussia westward specifically to be the watch on the Rhine. They wanted the highly disciplined Prussian military machine sitting right on France's doorstep.
That seems like a big shift.
It was, and it had a massive unintended consequence. It shifted Prussia's center of gravity from the east to the west, which eventually made them the dominant power in Germany.
Speaking of Germany, this is another area where the map changed drastically in 1815. Napoleon had completely smashed the old Holy Roman Empire. Did the Congress try to put that back together?
They couldn't. The Holy Roman Empire was a mess of over 300 tiny, independent states. It was Humpty Dumpty. You just couldn't put it back together. So they created the German Confederation, or the Bund. They consolidated those 300 states down to 39.
39. That's a massive consolidation.
It is, and the logic was exactly the same as with France. 39 states are much easier to manage than 300. It created a Germany that was strong enough to defend itself against France or Russia, but, and this was the key for Metternich, it was too divided internally to be an offensive threat to its neighbors.
So Austria stays safe because Germany is just unorganized enough not to attack them.
Correct. And Austria assumed the presidency of this confederation to make sure they kept a lid on it.
So we had the ideology with conservatism, we have the map with these buffer states, but maps are just paper. You need a way to actually enforce this new world order. The sources describe something called the Concert of Europe.
This is arguably the most significant innovation of the entire era. Before this, diplomacy was highly reactive. You wait for a crisis to happen, and then you send an ambassador or an army. The Concert of Europe was proactive. It was an actual system.
Like a board of directors for the continent.
Yes, exactly. The great powers agreed to meet regularly to discuss issues before they turned into wars. It was really the ancestor of the United Nations or the Security Council, but it wasn't just about preventing wars between countries. It was about collective security against internal revolutions.
And this is the scary part, the Troppau Protocol.
Right. This was an agreement that basically said if a revolution happens in any country and it threatens the stability of Europe, the other powers have the right to intervene militarily to crush it.
Try to imagine that today. That's like saying if there's a protest in one country, that neighboring countries can just send in tanks to stop it because they don't want the protest across the border.
That is exactly what it was. When a liberal revolution broke out in Naples, Austrian troops marched right in and crushed it. When the Spanish people tried to force their king to accept a constitution, a French army acting under the orders of the alliance invaded Spain to restore the king's absolute power.
And this highlights a distinction in the notes that I think is really important for us to clarify. You have the Quadruple Alliance, which is political, but then there's this Holy Alliance. Are they the same thing?
Not quite, and the difference really matters. The Holy Alliance was Tsar Alexander's baby. He wanted a coalition of Christian monarchs, Russia, Prussia, Austria ruling based on Christian principles. It was very mystical, almost crusader-like in its language.
And where were the British on that?
The British wanted absolutely nothing to do with that. Castlereagh thought it was nonsense. The British were pragmatic. They wanted the Quadruple Alliance to keep the peace and stop France, but they weren't interested in a holy war against liberalism or policing every minor riot in Central Europe.
Because Britain was a constitutional monarchy itself.
Exactly. They had already had their revolution, so they weren't going to sign on to a treaty that said all constitutions are evil.
So there's tension even in the enforcement mechanism. But, looking at the scoreboard, it worked.
Strictly speaking, yes. This period is often called the Long Peace. Between the defeat of Napoleon in 1815 and the outbreak of World War I in 1914, there was no general European war that dragged in all the great powers at once.
That is a staggering statistic considering how incredibly violent the previous centuries were.
It really is. The Metternich system successfully prevented a major conflagration for decades. It allowed Europe to recover, economies to stabilize, and the Industrial Revolution to really take root.
And it's a massive but. We have to talk about the pressure cooker. Because while the diplomats were high-fiving in the palaces of Vienna, what was actually happening on the streets?
The Congress made one fatal miscalculation. They completely ignored the two most powerful forces of the 19th century, which were nationalism and liberalism.
We touched on the map earlier, forcing the Belgians and the Dutch together just to make a buffer.
That's the perfect example of the failure of understanding nationalism. People were starting to deeply identify with their culture, their language, their shared history, not just whoever their king happened to be.
Right.
The Poles didn't want to be Russian. The Italians didn't want to be Austrian. The Belgians didn't want to be Dutch. By drawing lines on a map based entirely on military strategy rather than ethnic reality, the Congress guaranteed future conflict.
And liberalism. How did they miscalculate that?
Liberalism is the desire for rights. The French Revolution had let the genie out of the bottle. You had a rising middle-class students, intellectuals. They had tasted the idea of we the people. Metternich tried to stuff that genie back in with censorship, secret police, and spies.
The sources mention the famous Carlsbad decrees in Germany,
Oh.
shutting down student societies, heavily censoring the press.
Exactly. But you cannot kill an idea with a bayonet. By shutting off all avenues for peaceful reform, by just saying no to everything, they radicalized the opposition. They turned moderate liberals who just wanted a constitution into hardcore revolutionaries.
It's a classic dam analogy. You can stop the river for a while, but the water just gets deeper and heavier behind the wall.
And the dam eventually bursts. We see the first real cracks in 1830, but the absolute flood happens in 1848. They literally call it the Year of Revolutions.
Wow.
Yeah, almost every major capital in Europe exploded in violence. The system Metternich built came crashing down, and Metternich himself actually had to flee Vienna in disguise.
So if we step back and look at the legacy of the Congress of Vienna, it's really complicated. On one hand, they created a model for international cooperation that we still use today.
Absolutely, they did. The idea that great powers have a responsibility to manage the international system that is the DNA of the UN Security Council, they proved that diplomacy could replace war as the primary tool of international relations.
But on the other hand, they showed the incredible danger of ignoring the will of the people.
They bought order at the expense of progress. They froze Europe in a block of ice because they were absolutely terrified of the fire. And when the thaw finally came, it was violent.
It brings up a really difficult question, doesn't it? We look back at them as reactionaries or tyrants from our modern perspective. But they had just lived through the terror. They genuinely believed that if they gave an inch on democracy, the heads would literally start rolling again.
That's the real tragedy of it. They weren't cartoon villains. They were traumatized men trying to build a safe room for a continent. But they made the room so airtight that eventually nobody could breathe.
And that leads us to a final thought for you, the listener, to mull over. We live in a pretty chaotic world right now. There's always a temptation to look for a strong hand to settle things down, to just impose order from the top.
The Congress of Vienna is really the ultimate historical test case for order from above.
So the question is a forced peace, imposed by a few powerful leaders, a necessary easel to keep the world from burning? Or does suppressing those disruptive, messy, dangerous voices just guarantee a much bigger explosion down the road?
Metternich would say the safety is always worth the silence. I think history suggests otherwise.
A fascinating tension to think about. That's all we have for this deep dive into 1815. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you on the next one.